My name is Faith Schmidt, and today we will be discussing the Stanford Prison Experiment. Imagine this. The date's August 14th, 1971. You awake to the sound of police pounding at your front door. You open up and are immediately swarmed, handcuffed, and taken to a police vehicle. All of your neighbors are outside watching it all go down, and the pressure from the police officer holding your wrists as you're escorted to this vehicle is all you feel as they read your Miranda rights. Not sure of your crime, but it doesn't matter because now you're a criminal. This was the reality for 12 men as they awoke one morning. Now it must be understood that these men had sort of an idea of what was going on. They agreed to take part in an experiment known as the Stanford Prison Experiment. However, the reality of being pulled from your house by actual police officers is not something I think that they were prepared for. And I think that would make every single one of us here quite anxious. I'm a psychology major with hopes of working in prison systems with inmates one day. So when I heard of this experiment that explored the power play between prison guards and inmates and the effects that it had on their emotions as well as their psychological health, I was excited to learn more. The Stanford Prison Experiment was conducted by 24 men, 12 guards and 12 inmates, and recreated a prison environment. Today I will discuss first why it was created. Then I will dive into the idea of the details of the case, all of the background, and just how Zimbardo executed it. And then lastly, we will discuss the topic of how and why this experiment became so popular in modern day psychological medicine. First, let's discuss why this experiment was created. Philip Zimbardo and his colleagues were interested in the idea that the violent abuse reported by inmates from the guards was because of either a sadistic personality or violent environment. According to researcher Sal McLeod from the University of Manchester Division of Neuroscience and Experimental Psychology, he said they wanted to recreate a prison environment and see what would happen when you gave some men power but took away other men's freedom. He also wanted the experiment to look as real as possible, which is why he used actual police officers to arrest the men. Now that you understand why this experiment was created, let's talk about the background of the case. Zimbardo executed the experiment in the basement of the psychology building at the Stanford University. He randomly selected 24 men to be compensated if they could last the full 14 days. They would be compensated a total of $15, $90 roughly in today's world. Randomly, these men were chosen to either be guards or inmates. The guards were given uniforms that resembled that of actual correction officers. They were also given a baton to protect themselves, as well as reflective aviator sunglasses that allowed them to pull themselves from the inmates. In a journal entitled Revisiting the Stanford Prison Experiment, again examining demand characteristics and guard orientation, which was written by Jared Bartles, he discusses that the use of the reflective aviator sunglasses allowed for the guards to dissociate themselves from the inmates. And by dissociating themselves, it made it easier for them not to see the inmates as human. And because they didn't see the inmates as human, it made it easier for them to be okay with the psychological torture that they were putting them through. Eventually, the experiment ended after just 6 days, when it was meant to last 14. It became very apparent the abuse that the guards were putting the inmates through. They became not only physically abusive, but as well as emotional and psychologically abusive. The inmates began to show signs of physical and emotional distress, as well as anxiety. Now that you understand why this experiment was created and how it was conducted, let's talk about how and why this experiment became so popular. Zimbardo became very popular from this experiment because he finally showed that prison guards weren't awful people that you saw in movies. But when you give somebody a little bit too much power and put them in a violent prison environment, it can turn out that way. Zimbardo's experiment also became popular because it finally forced people to look at the ethical side of science. While Zimbardo's experiments might have become very popular, Zimbardo himself faced a lot of backlash because many people believed that it was ethically wrong to put people through what his inmates were experiencing. The Stanford Prison Experiment was an experiment created by Philip Zimbardo that discussed the power play between inmates and guards to see if guards were truly sadistic people, or if by placing them in an environment that was so violent it could cause them to be this way. Throughout the experiment, Zimbardo saw that many of his guards that he chose to be guards became very violent and had very violent tendencies. He even began to see these violent tendencies in himself, which is why the experiment was terminated after only 6 days. The experiment became popular because finally it showed that inmates weren't bad people, but they were given too much power and put into such a violent place. It also became popular because people were finally forced to look at the ethical side of science. They hadn't been looking at this before. In conclusion, 12 men woke up on the morning of August 14th, 1971. They were fully believing that they could last the next 2 weeks in a prison experiment. However, not a single one of them was mentally, physically, or emotionally ready for the abuse and the trauma that they were about to endure.